to continue to use it
If you
and
keep it like
need
this,
it.
I'm gonna go get a couple more.
Okay. Gotcha.
And as you think about what happens next in your life, because it is your turn, I hope that as you move into the next phase of your life and your success, that you consider 3 things that I'm going to tell you. The first is to be unapologetic about who you are. Thank you for that, like that. The second is to go places where you are not expected to be. And the third is to don't be the last. So I want to share with you a story. About 3 weeks ago, I was invited to go to this conference. It was a big snooty conference, super expensive. It was put on by this very wealthy man who went to prison and then came out, decided to do good things. And so he had this conference and he had a salon that I was invited to. It was a private discussion that he was moderating with the Board of Supervisors. So I went and I listened. It was a room of about 30 people, and not too many of us there. And so he was talking as much as he was asking questions and listening. And then at the end he said, I'm going to open it up to questions and answers. So I had a question. I was thinking, I'm going to ask this. And, I raised my hand. I had a good question. I had a good question that kind of took into consideration everybody in the audience. And so he said, okay, we'll go to questions. And he pointed to this man right in front of me who hadn't raised his hand. And he said, so friend Frank, what do you think about what we were talking about? Do you have any comments or questions about da-da-da-da-da? And Frank said, yeah, I didn't have a question, but that's a good point you raised, and da-da-da-da-da-da. So, okay, I was like, well, maybe he didn't see my hand, although I think it was the only one, but I'm going to raise it again. So I raised it again, and he pointed to somebody in the back of the room. And he said, so friend Sal, this is another friend of mine, do you maybe have a question about what we've been talking about? Da-da-da-da-da-da. He asked the question, and the guy said, well, you raise a good point. And he asked his question. So I'm looking at one of the Board of Supervisors, Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas, and I give him the eye, and he's giving me the eye. And then he leans over to the moderator, and he's like, the girl's got her hand up. So I raise my hand again. And he asks this light-skinned black sister sitting right in front of me, who also did not have her hand raised. He said, so-and-so, I know you're a friend of so-and-so. I don't know if you have a question, but what do you think about da-da-da-da-da? And so she commented. And so by then, other people who didn't have questions came up with questions, and they raised their hand, and he asked all of them their questions until the very end when he came to me. So, I had been stewing. I was so irritated. I had been stewing, and so by the time he got to me, I said, I'm not going to ask that question. Screw that question. I'm going to ask the question that I really want to ask. And so I did, and my question was about gentrification, because they were to the Board of Supervisors, and I said, well, how are you all going to manage gentrification in our communities? Because you see these little businesses that pop up and then folks come in and our communities turn into safari destinations, but then people leave and where are the amenities? And so the supervisor said, well, that's a really great question, and they answered it. And then this moderator said, well, I want to respond to that too. And he said, it's not just gentrification that's the trouble. It's reverse gentrification too. That happens with things like busing into schools. And you have these busing situations where you're busing poor kids into rich neighborhoods. And the poor kids, they rough up the rich kids, but that's okay, they need it. And the rich kids teach the poor kids stuff, and that's okay. But then what happens is, the rich folks like me, we get upset. and we leave. And then what happens to the community? It goes down. And so, the only way that these schools, get good and stay good is when you have these activist parents of these poor kids who really want to commit to the schools. And so that's what I think. And so, I sat there and I was listening to him, and I went through those 5 stages of grief, shock, denial, anger. But you land on acceptance. And I was thinking to myself, I said, I specifically asked a question that was not directed to this man. And he specifically reinserted himself back into the equation. And that was when I had my acceptance moment. I said, this is a great lesson for us all. Because this man was completely unapologetic about who he was. He didn't care. He was completely owning his perspective and his life. And you have to be that way too. Thank you. You have to be unapologetic in who you are. You have to be unapologetic in where you come from. All right. And you have to be unapologetic in what you're working towards.